I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the day when I can meet all of you in person instead of having another remote and virtual meeting. And I'll ask you to sort of bear with me because, as you know, it's always challenging to give a talk or a lecture remotely. I had hoped to try to share my notes, but I'm having some technical problems. And so I think what I'm going to do is to just go ahead and um, talk for about 20 minutes and then open it up to question and answer. So just to let you know, I've been at UNLV for about 20 years now. Prior to arriving here in 2001, I taught at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, and before that at Penn State University. So I've been around for a while, and as Dr. Phelps said, my primary area of expertise is on comparative politics in Latin America, but the bulk of my research has been on Mexico and to a lesser extent on Argentina, and then some sort of quantitative work which has looked sort of at the aggregate country level of the entire region of Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm excited to talk about the dynamics of Mexico-US relations in the era of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's also known as AMLO in Mexico since his election in December 2018. And my assumption again is that you don't have any background in bilateral relations between Mexico and the United States or in Mexican politics or history. So I'll try to provide a little bit of background before we get into the main areas. And just for some background on President López Obrador himself, he was elected again in December 2018 with about 53.2% of the vote in Mexico, which was the largest in recent history. He carried 31 of 32 states and Mexico City. Mexico City used to be called the Federal District. A few years ago, they just decided to rename it Mexico City. But like our federal district in the United States or District of Columbia, they have their own legislature. They also have elections. And unlike our Congress, they actually elect representatives to the Congress that have voting rights. President López Obrador ran twice before 2018. So this was his third attempt. And it was really a resounding victory. He had close losses, in particular in 2006, that were highly contested. But this was a resounding victory. And he had also formed a new political party called Morena. And the best translation of that is the National Regeneration Movement, which won 275 out of 500 seats in Mexico's lower house, that's their Chamber of Deputies, and 64 out of 128 seats in Mexico's Senate. His allies from Morena also won a number of governorships. And so the large context here is that when he came into office, he came in with a very large electoral mandate. He had a working majority in the Congress, and he also had record high public opinion approval ratings at that time for any recent president. Now, he's also faced a very challenging environment since then. Last year, as a result of the coronavirus, the result of the pandemic, Mexico's economy contracted by 8.5%. That's a huge contraction and decline in GDP. That's the largest since the Great Depression years in Mexico. And recent public opinion polls suggest that voters, about 47% think that he's doing poorly in terms of managing Mexico's economy. 52% disapprove of how he's handling the drug wars and criminal organizations, and that has implications for bilateral relations as well. Mexico has a midterm election coming up on June 6th, and although his party leads in most of the public opinion polls, there is some question whether or not he'll be able to hang on to his legislative majority. So that's part of the context. And the main question that I wanted to look at today are the sort of continuities and changes in Mexico-US relations given his election. And part of the intuition for this question has to do with the fact that López Obrador is widely regarded as a populist president in Mexico and in the Latin American context. Populism, as you probably have learned, is a very imprecise term. It's been used in a variety of ways to characterize and to analyze presidents in Latin America, and more recently, President Trump in the United States. But a sort of working definition of populism is that populist leaders often try to bypass existing institutions and parties to try to assert a direct relationship between themselves and voters, and in particular, their base of support. Populist leaders often will present themselves as being against an elite, including that might be economists or other people who have specialized knowledge about a range of topics, including science. And they are not above sometimes sort of personalizing attacks on existing institutions, including the media and even government institutions. Viewed that way, as a left-wing populist, to be sure, López Obrador exhibits some of the characteristics of a populist leader. And there is a large body of scholarship in the field of international relations that emphasizes that populist leaders in Latin America often exhibit a distinctive approach to foreign policy compared to non-populist leaders, and in particular, a distinctive foreign policy approach with the United States. But many scholars who study Mexico have noted that although AMLO has populist characteristics, if you were to compare him to Hugo Chavez, who is now deceased, who's the former president of, and some would say dictator of Venezuela, Rafael Correa, who's a former president in Ecuador, Evo Morales, who was president of Bolivia, now trying to make a comeback there, or Nicolas Maduro, who is the current and disputed president of Venezuela. Although AMLO shares some characteristics with these other Latin American leaders, he also departs from them in significant ways in terms of his approach to foreign policy and his relationship with the United States. There is this question, though, nonetheless, and hence the reason for this lecture, in wondering whether or not, as a populist leader, he's been willing to alter or change any of the broad contours of Mexico's relationship with the United States. The other perspective here that IR scholars often use in studying Mexico-US relations emphasizes the importance of structural constraints and economic dependency. And since the 1980s, Mexico's economy has become very, very highly integrated with the United States. So if you know something about Mexico's history after the Mexican Revolution, in particular in the 1930s, when Mexico nationalized the oil industry, after World War II, when they embraced a sort of status model of economic development, Mexico tried to become more independent of Mexico economically. This is a long discussion, but the long and short of it is, in the 1980s, Mexico moved in a different direction. It joined the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in 1986, which lowered the barriers to trade, and then continued to pursue economic liberalization. They sold off lots of state enterprises. They opened up the economy to foreign investment. And this culminated really with Mexico's agreement with the United States and Canada, with the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. And as we'll talk about, that's been recently renegotiated. The agreement is called the TMEC, or what we call the USMCA agreement with Mexico. So as a result of Mexico's economic interdependence, or many in Mexico would argue dependence, Mexico has a very asymmetrical relationship with the United States. And the reasons are several. I mean, Mexico depends on the US for its exports. In some sectors of the Mexican economy, over 80 to 90% of everything they sell abroad goes to one market, the United States. And what that means is that as the trade relationship and the investment relationship goes with the United States, so go the prospects for generating economic growth and also employment. And even if we assume that, we acknowledge that Mexican presidents can't be reelected, they have one term. That's been a basic guiding principle in Mexico since the revolution and its adoption of the Constitution in 1917. All Mexican presidents want their party and their agenda to continue even after they leave office. And so in this sense, another body of scholarship, another approach in trying to analyze this relationship argues that even if AMLO is a populist president, he has confronted an environment even before the COVID pandemic in which the Mexican economy is so highly dependent on the US economy. He structurally and effectively has had very limited opportunities to really alter the basic contours of Mexico's relationship with the United States. As we'll see, there are some alternatives. China has been engaging Mexico and other countries in Latin America and certainly Africa. There's the European Union. But the long and short of it is those are long-term alternatives. And in the short run, at least during his presidency, many scholars have argued that he simply does not have the economic freedom, so to speak, to fundamentally change the relationship. And so to anticipate in the three areas that we're going to talk about, and those three areas have to do with the war on drugs and security as one area of the relationship. The second has to do with migration, which is connected. And the third has to do with economic ties. What we have seen thus far in AMLO's presidency, both during the Trump years and now sort of preliminary assessment during the presidency of President Biden, is that there has really been more continuity than change in Mexico's relationship with the United States, and that AMLO has often been reacting to pressure from the United States as opposed to setting the agenda, and that he's also shown himself to be quite pragmatic in sort of the tenor of his comments and his approach to the two US presidents that he's had to deal with. So that's our sort of organizing framework, thinking about this in terms of whether or not populism makes a difference, and also thinking about it in terms of Mexico's structural constraints and whether or not its economic dependency on the United States effectively limits the ability of Mexican presidents, regardless of their partisan orientation, to fundamentally alter that relationship with the United States. So let me say a little bit about, first of all, the security and the war on drugs. And this may be something that you are perhaps most familiar with, although when we often see reporting on this in the US press, it's usually at sort of a minimal level and doesn't provide very much context. Since about 2006, Mexico has had a more militarized war on criminal organizations that traffic drugs to the United States. And so it was a panista president, Felipe Calderón, who was a president from the center-right party, the National Action Party. He was president from 2006 to 2012, who initiated a more militarized campaign, which meant that he was willing to allow the armed forces in Mexico to take a more leading role and a more combative role with Mexican cartels in sort of prosecuting the war on drugs. And this was, of course, supported by the then Bush administration in the United States. And Peña Nieto, who was the president who came after him, essentially continued this sort of militarized approach in the war on drugs. The results thus far is that at least 250,000 people have been killed in Mexico since 2006 as a result of the war on drugs. Now, most of those people are people who work directly for the cartels or support them, but there are also a number of innocent bystanders and also members of law enforcement and the Mexican military who have been killed. The official estimate is that 62,000 people are missing on top of the 250,000 approximately who've been killed. And there has been concentrated violence in some areas. The Mexican military is widely viewed, and also members of law enforcement, as having violated human rights with impunity in many different parts of Mexico as a result of this sort of militarized campaign in the war on drugs. When AMLO was running for president, both in 2012, but also in 2018, he was highly critical of this militarized approach to the war on drugs. And the phrase that he often used, and this is a translation from Spanish, is hugs, not bullets. Hugs, not bullets. And what he meant by that was that his own approach is that the best way to bring down levels of violence in Mexico that are associated with drug trafficking, principally to the United States, is to address the root causes of criminality, including drug trafficking. And from his perspective, Mexico's change in economic orientation that started in the 1980s had not really paid dividends for most people in Mexico. Wages had not increased. Employment was stagnant in some areas. Many people still work in the informal economy. And if you really wanted to alter the incentive structure, so to speak, that induces people to sometimes embrace criminality, including joining cartels, you needed to have a different approach that involved social policy, not sort of a militarized campaign. And so he emphasized this hugs, not bullets, drug decriminalization, and what he called transitional justice. He often referred to this as security without war. He also said that this would be accompanied by a major effort to increase social spending. Now, this approach, after he was elected, did not play well with the Trump administration. And so in 2020, President Trump threatened to designate Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations under US law. And a designation of Los Zetas or other cartels as terrorist organizations would have meant more US militarization along the border. It would have meant sanctions, possibly higher tariffs, and even a pretext for a US military intervention in Mexico. In fact, many scholars have pointed out that in the more conservative areas of the press, people were sort of pushing a narrative that Mexico was a failed state and that AMLO's approach was a failed approach, and perhaps the US military would need to intervene in Mexico to restore order along the US-Mexico border and defending this in terms of US security and US interests. And the release of El Chapo's son, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Ovidio Guzman López is the son of Joaquin Guzman, who's known as El Chapo. He had been arrested in 2019 in an operation that was widely seen as a botched operation in Mexico. The cartel went on the offensive and actually started burning things and shooting people. And the pressure was so widespread that AMLO actually ordered the release of El Chapo's son, which was very, very controversial. And around the same time, a number of Mormon women and children in the border area with Chihuahua and Sonora were murdered. And that really intensified calls by the Trump administration for a more militarized, aggressive approach by AMLO against the cartels. And so in that context of this sort of escalating pressure from the Trump administration, what we find is that, in fact, President López Obrador altered course. And some things remain the same in his approach sort of in the war on drugs, which is to say he did not completely yield to the pressure from the United States, but in other areas, he did depart from the plan that he had articulated as a presidential candidate. And so one thing that he did is he created a National Guard force, which was seen primarily as a concession to US pressure from the United States. And this National Guard force is a hybrid military and police force. And they tend to use the same sort of militarized approach in dealing with the drug cartels in Mexico. In fact, even though AMLO was very critical of this approach of his predecessors of trying to decapitate the cartels, as they called it, which means if you arrest and take away the head of the organization will fail. AMLO had been very critical of that. The National Guard force and other law enforcement elements in Mexico continue to use the same approach. And Guzman Lopez's arrest, El Chapo's son's arrest, was largely seen as sort of reflective of this, which suggests again that there has actually been some continuity in Mexico's approach in the war on drugs as a result of US pressure. As we'll talk about too, the cartels often profit from migration flows from Central America. And so in some ways, President Lopez Obrador's on migration from Central America intersects with his overall approach to war on drugs. The things which have changed, however, is that Mexico is moving forward with drug decriminalization. So you may have read that in March of this year, the Chamber of Deputies in Mexico approved legislation to legalize marijuana. The Senate in Mexico is considering the legislation, and it's expected to pass, and it is supported by the president. And this again is seen and framed as a way of combating the war on drugs, which is to say, from the president's perspective in Mexico, if you legalize drugs, including marijuana, that takes away the economic incentive to be involved in criminality. So in this one area, and we can certainly talk more about it, you see both evidence of continuity and change, which is suggestive again of sort of the limits of what a populist president can do to fundamentally alter Mexico's course in the war on drugs because of Mexico's dependence on the US and the fact that it's an asymmetrical relationship. A second area that I want to highlight has to do with immigration, and this again is connected in some ways to the war on drugs, although it's also distinct. Talking about the reasons for migration flows from Mexico to the United States is a long and complicated discussion. As you probably have learned, because it was a campaign issue in the United States, much of the migration from Mexico to the United States does not actually involve migration, authorized or not, from Mexico, but actually migrants who are leaving El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, who then migrate through Mexico to the US border. And the causes are complex. The long and short of it is that there have been natural disasters in some of these countries which have ruined crops and displaced people. And there's also just been a general problem in all three of these countries of a lack of economic opportunity in the formal sector of the economy, stagnation in wages, and for the types of crops that people produce, often the producer prices are after adjusting for inflation, are not great. So often people are motivated to migrate to the United States in order to find jobs and then to send income back to family members in those countries, what we call in economics remittance flows. But frankly, all three of these countries have also struggled with growing criminality, and with that criminality, people have often been threatened in different parts of all three countries, that is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, by criminal organizations. And that has also created some tension for people to leave the country. And historically, when there were insurgency and rebel movements in those countries, and the US supported through its own foreign policy counterinsurgency movements, many people were displaced. And so just take Guatemala's civil war, more than 1 million people were displaced between like 1978 and the early 1980s as the military, with full US support from the US military and the US government, engaged in sort of a slash and burn campaign against areas in Guatemala that were suspected of being sympathizers for left-wing rebels. So, political turmoil, criminality, and a lack of economic opportunity are really the root causes why we've seen such large levels of migration flows from those countries through Mexico to the US border. Initially, President López Obrador had proposed a regional development plan, again, to address the root causes of migration from those countries. That is to say, a regional development plan that would reduce poverty, create jobs, and promote economic security as a means of stemming unauthorized migration flows through Mexico to the United States. President Trump was a critic of US aid, and he was not in favor of any sort of regional plan. And in fact, President Trump struck out his own bilateral agreements with some of those countries that basically said the US was going to cut aid, and what little aid would be remaining would be conditioned on whether or not El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras would actually militarize their own borders and stop migration flows through Mexico to the United States. So, AMLO's approach was not supported. And as we started the negotiations for NAFTA, President Trump made it clear that if Mexico did not cooperate with the United States on migration, that would have consequences for what would happen with the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that was seen as being a very credible threat because President Trump had shown on several occasions his willingness to withdraw from regional and international agreements ranging from climate change to ones, the World Health Organization, as we saw, to others that involved military alliances where he didn't withdraw, but he certainly questioned them. So under this pressure, although President López Obrador had always said that Mexico would try to have a humane approach towards migrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the intensifying pressure from President Trump really forced him, I would argue, into a different policy direction. And so one piece of evidence sort of supporting that interpretation is that AMLO mobilized 25,000 troops from the new National Guard force that he had created to combat the cartels, and actually sent those 25,000 troops from the National Guard to the southern border. The idea of having Mexican officials or troops on the southern border is not new. That goes back to the Merida initiative in the 2000s. But the scale of this mobilization was really unprecedented. And so effectively, this was another way of sort of yielding to US pressure to militarize the border between Mexico and Central American countries as a way of sort of stemming those migration flows. And President López Obrador also, implemented decrees that forced migrants to stay in Chiapas, which is a very poor state in southern Mexico. He made use of COVID and the pandemic to basically say that, to try to restrict the movement of Central American migrants on public health grounds. And most significantly, although he refused to sign an agreement with the Trump administration to provide a so-called safe third-party country for the United States for people who were seeking asylum in the United States, he eventually agreed to what's known as the Migrant Protection Protocols. Some critics said this was a euphemism. What was widely called in the US press the Remain in Mexico policy. And the Remain in Mexico policy essentially resulted in people who sought asylum in the US going to the border, registering, and then immediately being expelled back to the United States to wait for their asylum hearing, which could take years. And by the time of our election, more than 60,000 migrants who were applying for asylum were in Mexico under this so-called Remain in Mexico policy. That policy really deviated from AMLO's stated principles as a populist leader in some ways, but it's also reflective of this pragmatic approach that he adopted with the Trump administration, because Trump had really prioritized immigration control as it was really so important to the core constituency of President Trump and President Trump's movement. Now, President Biden has ended the Remain in Mexico program. President Biden has pledged up to $4 billion in aid to Central America, but that will take some time to work out. And as many scholars have noted, effectively what President Trump put in place remains in place in significant ways in Mexico. And so President Biden has signaled to AMLO that he appreciates Mexico's ongoing cooperation to use the National Guard to stem the flow of migrants from Central America, for example. So again, this is an area when we're talking about immigration that you see a lot of continuity rather than change in the fundamental dynamics and the overall contour of relations with the United States. The third and final area I want to talk about briefly, I know I've been going on for a few minutes here, has to do with economic relations. And it's very interesting that AMLO had always campaigned as being against against NAFTA and against neoliberalism. And neoliberalism in this context means economic liberalism, free markets, essentially. So AMLO had always said that, trade between the United States and Mexico hurt Mexican farmers, for example, in the agricultural sector. And he had always said that he would be in favor of renegotiating NAFTA. In many ways, President Trump, stole his thunder, because it was Trump who immediately, snapped Canada and Mexico into, or not snapped, but he demanded essentially a negotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and said that if he couldn't get Mexico and Canada to agree, he would either strike a bilateral agreement with one or the other, or he would simply withdraw from NAFTA altogether. And the new USMCA agreement is a complex agreement, and I'll only highlight a couple of points here because I'll just tell you on the side, I do research on the auto industry in Mexico. I have been doing research on that sector for almost 30 years now. And in some ways, the new agreement, the so-called USMCA agreement with US, Mexico, and Canada, the most far-reaching changes were actually in the auto industry. And so just to give you an example of things that Mexico agreed to, when the USMCA agreement went into place, the new agreement required producers in Mexico to have a much higher regional content rule. And the reason for this is that, there are German companies, Korean, and now Chinese and Japanese car companies. So Nissan, Kia, Hyundai, Giant Motors, which is a Chinese company, Volkswagen, that all produce in Mexico. And the charge has been for a long time that they make use of Mexican workers who are highly productive but are relatively low paid to produce cars that are then sold at an enormous profit in the United States when Mexico exports those finished vehicles to the United States. So what the US had really demanded, and President Trump was very focused on the auto industry. I mean, he saw it as sort of a bellwether for what was happening in US manufacturing, or the decline in US manufacturing. So what this agreement did, and Mexico agreed reluctantly, is to raise the regional content rule, which means, for example, that now 75% of automotive parts, wire harnesses, engines, dashboards, seats in vehicles have to be sourced from companies in Mexico, Canada, or the United States. And so that means now, in particular, that foreign companies, non-US companies that operate in Mexico will be forced to use a lot more content produced by companies in North America if they want to qualify for the lower tariffs on car exports to the United States. And so that's seen as essentially being a threat to Japanese, German, and Korean and Chinese car companies that produce in Mexico and sell to the United States. It will probably not disadvantage US companies. And it was a major concession that Mexico and Canada made to the United States in the negotiations. The other thing which is important is that Mexico agreed that 40 to 45% of the input in engines and cars will have to be made by workers who are paid $16 an hour. And just to put this in context, at present, Mexican workers make no more than about $3 to $3.50 an hour. And so, raising wages to $16 an hour is probably not feasible. Car companies in Mexico are trying to interpret this to see if there are ways around it, but this was another major concession that Mexico made. And the other part of this agreement, which was a major change, is that it strengthened a lot of protections for workers in Mexico. And that's a long discussion, but the long and short of it is, in the car industry, for example, there are lots of unions that exist, but they are not real, genuine unions. They were formed before plants ever open. Workers didn't know that they existed, and they never got a copy of their collective bargaining agreement. They don't participate in negotiations. And so a union exists on paper, but it's not a genuine union. what the Trump administration forced on Mexico, and this was actually something that AMLO agreed with, it resonated in some ways with his sort of left-wing populist agenda, was to ramp up enforcement of Mexican labor law to make sure that you have sort of genuine union democracy and worker approval of contracts. So to summarize here, in sort of the, economic relations, you also see some changes, but you also saw that Mexico was really in a defensive position and acceded to many of the demands made by the United States. The one area that AMLO was able to sort of cordon off and not yield to US pressure is in the oil industry, and we can talk about that. Oil is a very sensitive topic in Mexico. Production has been declining. In 2013, they tried to open up the industry to more participation in foreign companies to work with Pemex, which is the national oil company, to improve production. But AMLO has really resisted that because he sees the oil industry, some would say this is an antiquated view, but really as the engine of Mexican development. So, the US made some demands in the oil industry and didn't get a whole lot of concessions, but frankly, automotive trade between the US and Mexico is really so large, the changes in that one sector really spoke to the asymmetry in this relationship and how much influence the United States had in sort of dictating changes in US-Mexico relations. So I'll stop there, and sorry if I went a little bit longer than I had anticipated, and I will open it up to any questions that you have now.